Kallan stirred at the unmistakable hush of rain. The rancid stench of the Devagar was gone. In its place, the soft, sweet scent of lightly chilled earth engulfed her senses. The fire popped, and Kallan jerked awake, opening a single eye. A dilapidated shack suspended the remains of a low ceiling that barely provided rudimentary shelter. One full wall and half of a second had rotted away, leaving much of the bowed ceiling suspended by derelict corner posts and withered wall planks secured to the floorboards where she lay. Kallan curled the tips of her fingers against the grains of a wooden weathered plank. A fire in all its wonderful collection of smells of smoke, dry earth, and charred wood mingled with the delicious scent of roasted grouse. Her belly tightened with hunger, and a cool breeze hit the ground, rolling. It swept up and over her body, sending a gentle chill through her. Light of the midday sun shone through the rains. She had to work to focus her one eye on the clear, white rain that fell like sheets onto a variety of wild ferns peppered with hardened tundra. It rolled like the sea, blanketed in crimson, orange, and yellow. The foliage had grown, spreading wild into the shelter through the mostly missing walls. An arm's length away, a single tundra flower grew, and she stared, mesmerized by its simplicity. The fire crackled, drawing Kallan's attention to Rune, who sat studying her with eyes too dark to read. He didn't falter when she glanced at him, or when she looked back to the light, lost in thoughts to the cave. The bitter tang that had dulled her senses and made her indifferent to the beatings was gone. She could feel everything now, and began to assess the damage. More ribs were cracked, fractured, and shattered than were whole. Her nose had been broken and reset recently. Crushed into powder, the smallest finger of her left hand descended into her signet ring. Swelling forced her right eye closed, significantly limiting her vision. She could hardly breathe, but as much as it hurt to move, it hurt more to be still. Attempting to stand, Kallan shifted her stiff legs, but something thick and heavy restricted her movement. She glanced down, and hot anger devoured her insides. Splayed over her body, on top of a blanket, the leather overcoat lined with fur lay. Drui. Kallan twisted her face. Something between hate and rage grew, and she bit the corner of her bottom lip as she fought back the urge to cry. Upon careful inspection, she discovered that her new warden had taken the liberty of stripping off the remnants of her chemise, and replaced her clothes with a heavy green woolen tunic that loosely hung from her shoulders to her knees. A pair of plain trousers, too large for any woman, extended well past her ankles, and Rune had obviously washed the first layer of grime from her skin. Despite her battered body, overall she was comfortable and warm. Kallan shifted again to stand, forcing Rune to emit a syllable that sounded too much like a botched protest. She stumbled and fell, breaking her fall on a crushed finger. Like a curtain, her hair fell, shielding her face from Rune. Anger sent tremors through her. Each bruise that covered her, each cut that burned, sent wave after wave of agony that seemed to start at the side of her hand. She bit her lip, quelling her anger, and arousing the hate that Devagar had seated there. Memories clawed at her head of the pang, of the darkness, of the nightmare she had endured for so long. Tears burned her eyes as a giant wave of hate washed over her, dragging her into the darkest, most fathoms of abhorrence, where vengeance brewed. Kallan's body shook against the silent screams, making her aware of every ache the Devagar had inflicted. A greater loathing settled as she ached to scream, to lash out and cry, but no Devagar sat before her, only Rune, who sat silently with her, oblivious of the desecration she endured. Kallan waited to speak until she could slow her breath and ease her rage. "Where am I?" she gasped, careful to keep her face hidden behind her hair. Sounds scraped her throat, and she shook, coughing on the words. Worry enclosed her mind as she drew in a long, deep breath, forcing herself at ease. "Where?" she growled again, and lifted her eyes to Rune. Tears burned the back of her throat. "Uplant," Rune said, "as of yesterday." His voice was like sweet honey, and assured her the last of the caves were behind her, and she hated him for it. Kallan gasped, and her good eye widened at the rising sick. "Midgard." Rune nodded. "Drink this," he said, shoving a tankard at her before she could speak further. Too weak to object, Kallan accepted the tankard of hot tea that soothed while she drank. It flowed down her throat, coating the muscle with the familiar sweetness of black currant tea. She coughed. "Where is Astrid?" she asked. "Safe," he answered. Again, Kallan drank. The liquid hit her belly, immediately flipping it on its inside. She fought back the rising nausea as Rune rotated the multiple skewers of roasted grouse over the fire, and her stomach clenched for food. Before yesterday, her throat clamped shut against the words. Where was I? The pause that followed confirmed Rune didn't want to tell her. Jotunheim, he replied. The single word doused her back with a chill. Kallan shuddered and forced the neck words out. You went to Gunir. The words dripped with resentment. Why did you come back? She asked, lifting her eyes from her hair. Bergen went to Gunir, Rune corrected. It was he they followed. He removed a spear of meat and passed her the smallest one, which she devoured within moments, easing one cramp in her stomach as another, more prominent cramp doubled in objection. By the time I caught up to you, they were preparing for their descent into the Schwelt Alfheim, Rune said through a mouth-watering slice of grouse. You've been unconscious since. While she attempted to process his story, Rune took a moment to look her over her condition. I reset your nose and bound your ribs, he said. Several of them are broken. Most are cracked. Your eye... Rune trailed off. I am no healer, and Geralf isn't here. I did what I could. Kallan dabbed at the swollen flesh around her eye that felt strangely empty. Your finger was smashed, he said. I did my best to splint it, but found nothing in the bags or your pouch to help much. Kallan looked to the smallest finger of her left hand and raised the bandaged mess. After inspecting it, she knelt back on her makeshift bed. Her thoughts drifted, and Rune gave her a moment of silence before beginning the plethora of questions he must have waited to ask. Did they tell you what they wanted? Rune asked. Repeatedly, she whispered. Where is my pouch? She could see the reservation stay in his hand. After a moment, Rune turned to the leather bag behind him, exposing the hilt of an elding blade encrusted with fine jewels that drew her attention. Where did you get that? Kallan said. Her voice was barely a breath. Rune didn't answer. She tightened her jaw, repressing the countless questions that came, as Rune pulled the pouch of Amadou from the bag of supplies. With her good hand, Kallan snatched the pouch. I already emptied it of whatever herbs I could identify, Rune said. There wasn't much. Kallan shook as she shuffled the contents, pushing her way past potion packets and herbs, until her fingers clasped Idun's apple. The shimmering fruit with golden skin glistened like the opals in the sword behind Rune. Sinking her teeth into its flesh, Kallan ravished the apple in a few mouthfuls. After the smooth fruit slid down her throat, Kallan focused and muttered a charm as she reached for her scythe. She was elated to find it there, intact, eager, and readily waiting. The scythe flowed and mingled with the scythe from the apple, repairing the damage done as it moved through her. Muscle fibers rewove themselves and bones recalcified, returning to their original state. Bruises vanished as the cloths broke down, urging her blood to flow. Her heart pounded her chest with zealous vigor. As Kallan took her fifth bite, her ligaments and the nerves in her finger reknitted themselves, and fluids restored her eye. Free of the pain that had limited each breath, Kallan fell to her hands as the last rib mended itself. She gasped against the sudden rush of air, and drew in long, deep breaths that fully expanded her unbruised lungs, leaving her lightheaded. When she found her breath again, the only evidence that remained of her captivity was the filth of the cave that still clung to her iridescent skin. How? Rune asked. Kallan looked up. Silence and cold confirmation stared from behind Rune's eyes. Kallan scoffed. You brought me here. You took me from my city. Were it not for you, I would still be in Lorlenalin. Were it not for you, my father would still be alive. And you want me to answer how? The rain fell in a constant sheet, striking the ground with a persistent patter that did well to drown out unwanted thoughts. Free of the incessant pain, Kallan turned her eyes to the elements and scrambled to her feet, taking care to secure the pouch around her waist while she did so. Eager for the taste of her restored freedom, Kallan leapt from the blanket and overcoat, scrambled her way out of the dilapidated lean-to, and stepped into the clean, cool rain. She pulled each breath deep in her lungs and lifted her face to the sky, welcoming the shower as it washed the filth from her skin. Like tiny red rivers, blood and black streamed from her hair and face and pooled down her body to her bare feet, free of the lacerations, calluses, and scabs from the cave floors. The soft earth beneath her feet was kinder than any night she had spent among the Devagar. The winds of Midgard blew cold than she had ever remembered in Alfheim, and the rain seemed tainted somehow, weighted with a grief she couldn't place. Closing her eyes, Kallan pulled from her core. The scythe flooded to each limb, mingling with each fiber as if it twisted and wove its way through her, restoring her very cells to their beginnings. The last of the pain vanished, nurturing the life that shone with renewed energy in its stead. When Kallan opened her eyes, her plans were clear, her path decided. "I won't stay here," Kallan called through the rain. Rune stood. She was more than vaguely aware of his heightened guard, alert and ready to leap the moment she moved. "Where is Astrid?" she called over the rushing rain, not bothering to lower her face from the skies. She expected him not to answer at all, and jumped when he spoke. "There's a lake at the base of this hillside," he answered. "He waits by the river that flows from the north." Inexplicable anger surged, and Kallan shook with the effort it took to contain it. "You left him?" "You had a fever," Rune answered. "I couldn't afford to keep you in the rain, and there are no shelters by the river, nor could Astrid make the climb. He's hidden and safe. I checked on him not an hour ago." Kallan trembled with rage that pulsed through her. She felt her scythe pulling and clutched her fists at her side. "How many days from Alfheim?" she asked, indifferent to the rain. "Come out of the rain, Kallan," Rune bade coldly. Kallan dropped her face from the sky. Rune's hand rested casually on the hilt of her dagger buried in the waist of his trousers. His face, forever hardened on hers, was as unreadable as always. "How many days?" she repeated. 14. A sudden sick tightened her stomach. How long was I? 12 days. Her head spun as if it tried to find a way to understand that her endless captivity had only lasted 12 days. 12 days, she breathed. 12 days without sunlight, 12 days without rain. It felt like 12 months. "Come out of the rain, Kallan." "I'm leaving," she said, overwhelmed with the want to run. "And where will you go?" Rune asked. "The Devagar will suspect the road to Alfheim. They'll swarm those roads hunting you. We go north, to the Dolor," he said. He wasn't asking. "To Nidaros?" she asked. "Hakon Jarl is there." "Hakon is Jarl there," Rune explained. "My brother and I traveled this road decades ago and formed alliances with Lade. We can get a boat to Nidaros and sail to the fjords. We'll be in Alfheim in 8 days. Kallan didn't move. "I'm going south." "You won't make it," Rune said. "I am not your prisoner." Her rage swelled with the scythe in her hands, holding back as she remembered the last time she hit him with scythe. "I'll go where I like." Rune drew in a deep breath as if pacing his irritation. "The land is different here," he said. "The tundra is littered with jagged rocks. For miles, large white stones are scattered throughout the land. The terrain is rough, the forests are thick, and if we venture too far west, the land will drop into the sea, sometimes without warning. The wrong path could leave us doubling back for weeks. There are marshlands in the east that make it impossible for a horse. It will be slow moving, slower with a horse." "You don't know what Astrid can do. You don't know the area, Kallan," Rune said. "I've traveled Midgard before. I will go alone." In that instant, Rune was on her, slamming her into a tree and pinning her back with an arm across her collar as he clamped her wrist. "You don't know what you're up against here, Sidkona," he said. "The monsters here are nothing like our own." "I've been gone too long," she said. "We both have." He gave a look that dared her to argue that point. "But Midgard has its own wars, and we are currently standing in the middle of them. An unwanted king has seized this land. He comes with a law he enforces in the name of his own gods. He seeks to challenge Asgard, hunting the Sidkona as he goes." Kallan stopped fighting for the moment, frozen by his words. "He hunts Sidkona," she whispered. She shuddered against the tree, eager to break Rune's neck. "Your scythe is not a weapon here," he said. "It will betray you. And if they find you, if they know you are here, they will not let you live long enough to make it to Alfheim. They will follow you to the borders and will not stop until you're dead." The rain fell down their faces, coating them in the drab gray that blended them into the surrounding wood. Rune sighed. For the moment, he had her attention. "All roads leading south of Viken are crawling with his men," Rune said. Kallan's face twisted back, sending him to a fit that impelled her to attack. She wanted to run, to scream, to cry, and hated Rune all the more for taking her from Lorlenalin. "We must head north, across the Dolor. All at once, Kallan slammed her knee up into Rune, who gasped through the piercing anguish of electrical pulses that radiated up his lower back. Unable to breathe, he clutched his groin and fell to the ground on his knees. Yanking her wrist free, Kallan snagged her dagger from his belt and stepped around the heap that was Rune. "I follow no enemies," Kallan said, brandishing her blade. After snatching the blanket from her bed and doubling back for one of the bags, she began the descent down the mountain side. A fire burned in Rune's silver-blue eyes. Grumbling beneath his breath, he forced himself to his feet. It was slow going as he released a series of short breaths and waited for the majority of the sharp pain to subside to the dull throb that would follow him for hours. "It's going to be like this, is it?" he grunted, and taking in a long breath he gazed at the trail where Kallan had ventured. Her head cocked high with confidence, Lee confirmed she would be harder to take down than he thought. "All right, then," he said, and following suit, bounded down the mountain path behind her.